There you go. So what do you mean shrink? Like minimize? Okay. Awesome. All right, I've got like 9,000 slides, and I'm going to try to do them in an hour, so I won't be going slow. That probably won't be different for any other talk I do. So this is the fun talk. This is the part 1 of 2. Part 2 is actually at 5 o'clock, and that's all the dirty stuff I can't talk about on TV. This is all the stuff leading up to it. So there's still a lot of data, still a lot of kind of fun macro stuff, but it's not like the crap that'll probably get me arrested, which is the next talk probably. I don't know actually. So this talks about quantifying security research by actually looking for the stuff in the wild. You see security researchers come out and say, you know what, I found this vulnerability in, Jim Bob chat application, and it's terrible, and I deserve to get a crown for this and sit on a throne or Nobel Peace Prize. I found Jim Bob's chat application vulnerability. In reality, no one cares, but no one uses the damn thing. However, we don't really have the data to say whether or not someone uses that application or not today. So you have all these security researchers saying this vulnerability is gigantic and everyone should be paying attention to it. At the same time, you've got the vendors saying, no, this isn't a big deal at all. You're crazy. No one really uses this configuration. How do you find the truth between those two things? And that's really what this is about, is how do you actually measure the truth of exposure for a particular application across the internet at a global level? And then what kind of fun things can you do with it? So advisories suck. They don't have much data. They're affected versions, related configurations, things like that. Not really much fun. There's no real data about the impact of the vulnerabilities. They don't tell you, hey, this vulnerability is actually going to cause the World Trade Center to melt down, or it's going to cause, this hospital to iron lung to stop moving. Like, they don't have that data. They can't say that data. They've got nothing to measure it against. There's some sources out there today, but there's not a whole lot of there's nothing really besides a Google dork you can do to find out the impact of something. There is SHODAN, of course. You can use that for some of it, but it's not necessarily application specific yet. So there's not really much data you can use to accurately say what the impact of a vulnerability is today. So we don't really worry about the security of other people. We really worry about the security of ourselves, and that's really it. Your responsibility typically ends at your own firewall or at your ISP's uplink, and that's it. You don't care about anything outside of that. It's not your business. You don't really care. So we're kind of this society of walled gardens when it comes to networking. We don't really care about our peers. We don't care about our clients' networks so far as they pay us. We don't care about a lot of things in terms of other people's security unless there's some direct impact on our revenue or on our business. In reality, all those other networks really do affect us. Every time you go to the doctor's office and you're signing those 15 forms telling you, basically giving them the permission to share your entire medical record with, anybody they want to. That's a case that you really do depend on their security. You depend on their ability to use a shredder, on actually storing data securely, or someone's going to find out about, that wart you have in your toe, or worse, right? Anytime you're defending against a DDoS attack, the machines that are actually attacking you, those aren't some attacker who's been out the internet with their cluster of machines. That's a whole bunch of owned boxes they're using to attack you. And why were those boxes owned? Because no one cared about their networks. The people who were in charge of them couldn't secure them. No one could really solve the problem before it turned into a DDoS against you. That's really the problem with malware, bots, Trojans, things like that these days, is they're all using innocent people's machines as weapons against other folks. Anytime you get a data loss letter, you start caring a whole lot about that particular provider's security. Every time there's a major breach, like, wow, crap, I got 3 letters this month. This sucks. How come they can't get their crap together? So that's when you really start caring about other people's security. And spam, of course, is the same problem as DDoS. It's all usually going through compromised machines these days. You don't have a whole lot of bad hosts on the internet left. Most ISPs want to stay connected, don't want their uplinks to cut them off, and so there aren't really that many spam havens these days. There really are just a bunch of owned boxes sending spam. So we actually are affected by the lousy security of other people. We can't do anything about that. We don't really recognize that in terms of how we act or what we do. But in reality, this is really, the more we know about everyone else, the better we can defend ourselves, the better we can secure the network as a whole. But most of the approaches to this are pretty much reactive. They're blacklist based. They're saying things like, anytime your machine is compromised and you show up on a blacklist, we'll put you on this list for a month or 2 until you get removed. So great, you've taken some random Joe Schmo who got his box owned, and they're penalizing him for the fact that he didn't know what he was doing for 2 or 3 months. You're not really helping anybody at this point. So most of the blacklists out there just really aren't useful because you don't have some internet hacker sitting on his throne rubbing his hands together with a bunch of boxes at his feet. You've got someone owning a bunch of other boxes that are now being put on these blacklists. And yeah, the blacklists are really the only way to carry some responsibility back to the ISP to have their clients take care of this stuff. But at the same time, the clients generally aren't the ones responsible. They build houses, or they sell widgets. They do something else. That's not their business doing security. So what I want to do is kind of invert this. Instead of having a blacklist, let's kind of invert this and let's create a whitelist, if you will, of machines that aren't owned, because that's usually more the case these days. The only problem is you can't figure out whether the machine is compromised just by looking at it usually. You can scan it, you can look for things, you can look for traffic coming out of it, you look for scanned sources coming from this machine, but it's really difficult to find out whether some random box on the internet is owned today. However, you can guess based on the data you have by doing some active scanning. So what I want to do is actually say, let's look at the entire internet, let's scan the bejesus out of it, and let's actually predict which boxes will get owned when, and then what the resulting data loss will be. And let's use that data to actually tune our advisories, tune our research, tune our exploitation to really go after what matters the most, as opposed to saying, let's go exploit this PHP web app again, which is no fun. So I'm going to fly through this because I know we're short on time. So the tricky part of this is how do you actually measure this stuff? You need to be able to measure data in a way that you can then query later on, that when a vulnerability comes out in the future, you can then go back, look at your old data, and say, well, the impact of this vulnerability is X, Y, and Z because I've got the data showing as much. So I've actually had a couple case studies I'm going to talk about later on if there's time. MySQL and F5, for example, are cases where when the vulnerability came out recently, I was already sitting in a monster pile of data I can go back and look at to find out what the real impact was. So the fun part, gathering data. First, I'm going to talk about SHODAN. SHODAN is awesome. I love SHODAN. SHODAN's like, my hero at this point. John, he does an awesome job of getting more information about the internet's vulnerabilities and exposure to the rest of the world, and he hasn't gone to jail yet. So that's why I love him. He's legitimizing it through brute force at this point. So I love what he's doing. There's lots of really great data. So use SHODAN. It's cool. In this case, I searched for port 161 and Cisco. So every Cisco device with SNMP enabled that was in the SHODAN database as of a month ago or so. And then you can see there's about 95,000 devices with Cisco in the SNMP description. So if you look at the breakdown of the port SHODAN covers, they've recently expanded a whole lot lately, but it's really not that many ports. FTP, Secure Shell, Telnet, HTTP, HTTPS, SNMP, SIP, UPnP. Most of the work that he's been working on has been related to his HTTP and HTTPS surveys. So things like doing HTTP header analysis, doing things like SSL certificate analysis, really useful, great data. But it's really focused mostly on web overall. If you combine the HTTP and HTTPS data, that's really majority of SHODAN is just 90% plus web data in SHODAN. And great, web's everything, right? Web's what we care about most of the time, so that does make sense. But I want everything else. I want to have all the other fun nibbly bits of the internet that tell me things about machines that's not part of the web services. Things like FTP, SH Telnet, yes, but more of it. I also want to query NetBIOS. I want UPnP data. I want anything that gives me lots of bits I can measure going forward. So NetBIOS is great because it gives you the name of the machine, MAC addresses, from there you can for hardware addresses. UPnP tells you vendor information. SNMP is awesome if you have lots of it because it gives you really detailed information on a large variety of devices. And of course, on the TCP protocol side, MySQL, getting versions of MySQL out there because they tend to get owned a lot. What's the easiest way to have data loss? Have someone own your data source and skip all those steps in between. So that's kind of what I'm looking at versus what SHODAN's looking at. So time to scan all the things. The fun part. So scanning the whole internet is tricky. If you want to scan TCP services, really two steps if you want to grab banners. You have to scan it once to find whether the port's open or not, do that with the SYN packet, look for SYN-ACK, done. That goes pretty quick, but you still have to collect the damn banners. That's the slow part. So you can do crazy amounts of ports per second if you're Dan Kaminsky. With 80, he's got a new scanner that's awesome. He's going to talk about later on. He's got a really neat way to do it. It's just difficult to collect banners at the same time unless you have a full-blown user land TCP stack, which he might have that I can't talk about. So anyways, TCP scanning. You have to find the port open, then connect to the port, grab the banner. Sometimes you have to poke the service a little bit, saying, "Hey, tell that application let's negotiate some FDFO, FDFO, won't crap before you give me the banner." UDP is actually two steps too because you want to send and receive the datagrams, the raw bits you send, but decoding them is too damn slow to do when you're scanning. You need those CPUs for sending more packets. So you actually send and receive the data, then store it all off as a file you can then process later on the back end. So really quick internet mass. If the internet is freaking tiny, there's more RAM in a 4 gig netbook than there are IPs on the internet in terms of bytes. With a single 4 gig stick of RAM, you can store 256 states about every IP on the internet without a problem and have lots of room to spare. So if you're looking at doing a big memory map of the entire internet, you don't really need that much data. It's actually pretty small. 32 bits is not big anymore. In reality, only about 3.2 billion IPs used, 3.3 billion these days, but it's really not going to get past 3.5 due to reserve blocks. If you want to send a single packet to everything on a really cheap-ass server that does 50,000 packets per second, 24 hours hit all 4 billion IPs. In reality, you can go a lot faster for a lot cheaper and a lot bigger boxes and pay a lot less. The reason for that is most of those crazy cheap VPS hosting services out there, yeah, they'll give you a really crappy VPS with like 1 gigahertz processor and 32 megs of RAM or something terrible like that. But it's running on a honking Xeon box that has like Intel E Pro 1000s in it that can actually send out 100,000 packets per second. So if you can write a scanning tool that doesn't use many CPU or memory resources, you can basically clog the entire E1000 card in that thing for $5 a month. From anywhere, like Russia, China, wherever. These boxes are all over the place. So you look at these cheap VPS providers, they think they're limiting you by giving you no memory, no CPU. In reality, for internet scanning project like this, it's really the rate limit of the network card itself and the throughput and the buffering of the card. So you can really cram some packets through these really cheap VPS providers. These days, I'm actually hitting every IP every 7 hours right now for UDP services, and 9 boxes in a cluster doing it, but each server is doing every 0/0 range in 7 hours. So for Nmap, for TCP scanning, I'm really lazy and I like Nmap, so I used Nmap. And Nmap is awesome if you tune it the right way. There's a great talk that Gordon did a couple years ago talking about how he scanned the whole internet as part of the World Scan project. I recommend looking at that. Here's just some settings I use, like parallelism, setting your SYN probe list to be also your port list, short circuits the TCP discovery phase. And I had a little crappy NSE script I sort of kind of wrote in Lua and copy-pasted together that will do things like telnet negotiation and do the right kind of protocol initialization for every port I talk to. That would get nice, clean data. So if it's SSL versus non-SSL, recognize that, catch the error, resend the GET request with non-SSL. If it's FTP, try logging into it to get the banner and so on. If it's telnet, do the negotiation sequence first to get the banner out of it. Unfortunately, I found out I'm really bad at Lua by doing a test scan with telnet and realized that it never broke out of the while loop. And so I was eating like 30 megabits per second with a Lua connection to some poor little router someplace. And the router is basically offline for 2 days. I'm like, oh, crap, let me fix that. So definitely test your tools better than I did before unleashing it upon the internet. Oh, here's the URL to the actual NSE script if you want to see my terrible Lua. It's mostly copy-pasted out of much better Lua developer's code. So for UDP is awesome, but there wasn't really any good tools out there to do large-scale UDP probes. So I wrote this little crappy C thing that spews out packets. You give it a file name of data, you give it a port number to send it to and a packet per second rate, and you feed it IPs and standard in, and it spits out data and standard out. That's it. So you can run about 3 or 4 of these per server, and you can get about 200,000 packets per second out of a really cheap server real easy. And it just goes. So this is how I get 7-hour scans these days. And that actually turns out to be about 1.2 gigabytes of traffic per server every 24 hours with just this one little thing running on it, just choking out packets as fast as it can, and it works out pretty well. So there's the usage case. There's should be a URL on the next page for where to download it. But this thing I ran on a bunch of Russian VPS nodes for a while and worked great. They kept thinking I was being DDoSed. I'm like, no, I'm not being DDoSed. All cool. Don't worry about it. It's all fine. That's not a DDoS. That's intentional OS. I don't know. So here's an example of what happens when you run the little UDP blaster script. This is on a box dev at single hop. You can see I actually had to rate limit it and drop it down to about 85,000 packets per second because I was going to run through my bandwidth queue too fast. I was going to hit 20 terabytes of traffic in like 5 days otherwise. So I knocked it down to about 645 or so, 645 gigs per day for that box, just so I can stay under the wire on it. But yeah, it works. So when you scan the internet, this is actually from yesterday. It's now 590 down here. I got lots and lots of abuse complaints. There's probably like 15 people I talked to so far since walking in today. They're like, hey, you scammed me. I'm like, yep, sorry. And a lot of folks work for MSSPs, and they've been basically having to deal with this traffic because I'm hitting them every 7 hours for 4 months. It's probably getting old. So sorry, guys. It's good data, though. You can do cool things with it. So I've gone to some ridiculous lengths to keep my support people happy at my ISP. I found out where they lived and got their home addresses and then sent them things. So I'm not sure whether they think that's good or bad, but they, we have an understanding. They got candy and I've got their home address, and that's how we keep it. Anyways, so I've had a pretty fun experience working with all these different ISPs. It ends up being about 2 hours a night of work for the last 3 months, just handling abuse complaints. Building up these huge exclusion files. I've got about 2,300 exclusions right now of different organizations that didn't want to be scanned anymore. It's like, great, I've already scanned you. I don't need that anymore. Done. Thanks. Here we go. So I've got some really fun ones. Someone demanded $10 million from me today in damages for me sending a packet to his little home router in New Zealand. I'm like, all right, buddy, good luck with that. The ISP basically laughed him off. I'm like, yeah, whatever, dude. Here you go. We'll give you a sticker. Here's a sticker. So the 2 ISPs that are awesome for this type of stuff is they actually are willing to give you the benefit of the doubt in security research are Linode and SingleHop.net. They are awesome. Give them all your monies. Single hop is better for large-term dedicated servers. Linode is better for really short, bursty stuff, but it's much more expensive if you have a lot of bandwidth. But anyways, they've been really good. You know, the Linode folks were so awesome. They took my 50 abuse reports per couple hours, collated them for me, sucked out all the exclusion lists, provided me like a configuration file with exclusions for all of them already. I'm like, sweet, I don't have to do anything. This is great. So I love those guys. And now this is my single hop abuse queue. I'm about 595 abuse complaints as of this morning now. So it just keeps on coming and just go through them all and reply back, yep, thanks, yep, scanning you, yep, you're getting scanned. So this is my email box, if you want to know what it looks like. It's about 9,000 pages of this. So complaint. This is so dshield.org has this really cool thing called the top 100 attackers list, or as I call it, my scoreboard. So I try to, if the top here, this is number 1 at the top. I haven't quite get number 1. I've got number 1 a couple times here, but this is number 1 through number 100 on the top 100 list for all 9 boxes I'm scanning with. So this is a course of 6 days or so in July. So this one's doing most of my UDP scanning, so it's always near the top, the urchin box. Then they kind of trickle way down. So this is basically every single hour for that 6-day period of my top 100 rankings for these machines. And here's a shiny version of it. So this is actually a clock. If you start going around, every tick on this is basically an hour mark all the way around. And the orange one down here, that's the UDP scanner. And this is the number of complaints coming into dshield.org and SANS incident.org over the 6-day period. So you can see it's kind of like a spiral. Some of the machines, like this is ping 03, gets a ton of traffic, gets a ton of complaints. And then as people start getting their networks excluded or saying, yeah, whatever, we'll just ignore it, it starts actually declining all the way around. So you can see the UDP scans, though, really aren't. They're getting a little bit thinner over here, but not by too much. They still is the #1 generator of complaints. So fun way to visualize how much people hate me. And here's like the fancy version, all the numbers and crap. But here's like the whole clock all the way around, hour by hour. And anyways, you're welcome to look at the data later on and play with it, but it's kind of fun. So storing all this crap, this is where it gets painful. 260 gigs of compressed XML for Nmap alone, and then another 40 gigs of compressed UDP files that are all the output for my UDP scans. Bring it all into Mongo. Mongo is actually the only thing I could find on the planet that's fast enough to do really quick upserts, because I don't want to have duplicates for every IP. I want to basically just keep overriding the latest data for the latest service. And having 150 million plus entries, that gets really expensive to do that with most database storage systems. So everything else melted down. I looked at Cassandra, I looked at Postgres with crazy tuning on it. I looked at React, looked at a bunch of crap, and Mongo is the only one that really kept up. Unfortunately, Mongo likes to corrupt its Bson database every 24 hours when I use it. So I've had to do a whole lot of like load a bunch of data into Mongo, dump it back out to JSON files, and then reload the JSON files back in so they won't be corrupted anymore. I keep cleaning the data like that over time to actually get the data to store. So finally got it mostly stable these days. MapReduce will still corrupt the database again. It looks like it's actually a data content issue, not a data storage issue. Let me see how I'm on time. Sweet, going quick. So we can spend some time on the fun stuff later. So this basically goes into Mongo, then Mongo gets dumped to Elasticsearch. Elasticsearch is Lucene plus kind of a NoSQL backend on top, and Elastic is great. So just so folks can start playing along, if you happen to have a laptop with you, let's see, dun, dun, dun. You know, let me just skip to the end of the slide real quick, make this easier. Wrong one. All right, let's try that again. So if you go to io.critical.io and use username Bsides, password Bsides, you can do neat little geographic maps of any query input you put in. So you can say, like, look for China, look for MySQL, look for whatever, and it shows you a nice little geographic map without the raw data on it yet. So I'm still trying to find a good way to do that without exposing all the vulnerabilities in the world. But right now it just shows you pretty maps for whatever query you give it. So that server's going to melt down in like 5 seconds, so get a head start now before no one else gets it. All right, let's move back up, and so all this is done through going from raw files to Mongo, Mongo to Elasticsearch, the Bson pipes, and then Elasticsearch is used for a lot of the facets and normalization as well. And then finally, a little Rails 3 interface at the top to search it. That's what your guys are hitting at Critical I/O. So really neat stuff. So when it's all said and done, I scanned lots of fun ports. I got when you scan MAC addresses, or sorry, when you scan NetBIOS, you also get MAC addresses back. And MAC addresses are great because they give you the vendor of the machine as well. And there's some fun things about MAC addresses you can use to really kind of hone in your vulnerability data when it's done. And MAC addresses are supposed to be globally unique, but they're really not. And we'll go into more of that in a second. UPnP is really cool. I'm actually going to talk about more of the UPnP stuff at 5 o'clock. But UPnP, there's only about 6 or 7 vendors in the world that make UPnP stacks. And no one's ever audited the damn things. So like grep-r, sprintf, and laugh. It's really that bad for SSDP. And like there's 33 million devices on the internet that have this service running. And you can make a fairly reliable exploit. So we'll dig into more of that later. But that gives you the OS information, the kernel version sometimes, things like that. MDNS is really cool as a thing to scan because MDNS being Bonjour or Avahi daemon or whatever you want to call it, it'll actually register any services running on a machine. So instead of having to basically port scan a box, you query MDNS saying, hey, what services do you have? And it just tells you. And the cool thing about that is if there's a custom proprietary service in that machine, it'll register that and serve it up by name. So you can be like, hey, what's this really weird thing I found? We'll talk about that in a second, too. Thanks. So a little bit on the highlight side. Here's where I ended up with the service data. This big old pink slice here, this is 80 TCP, which you expect to be pretty big. The little yellow guy down here, this is SSL. So I've got about 114 million hosts, about 156 million total IPs that are just web-based. And I've got 8080 in there too, but it's fairly small. The thing that really is different about this pie graph versus the SHODAN one, for example, is all these other big slices that aren't web. This block down here, this is actually SNMP data. There's 33.5 million devices on the internet that have SNMP exposed to the world with public. If you've ever seen a DDoS being done through SNMP reflection, that should scare the crap out of you because you can swing something like some number of terabits per second DDoS with those boxes just by doing a reflection from the request on that. This big pink slice right here, it's kind of weird. This is actually MDNS. Sorry, this is UPnP. So if you look at vulnerabilities in UPnP stacks, they're pretty significant. I mean, there's more of these things that I found than basically SSL services. They're pretty close to it, just in terms of overall impact number of boxes I found with random scanning. As you start going around the pie graph, you find less and less stuff. The really, really invisible little slice you can't see here at all, that's the bottom one on this list. They go kind of clockwise and then top to bottom. That's actually VxWorks Debug Services. So I talked about VxWorks here about 2 years ago, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means, but there's still tons of them out there. Other things notable in the kind of the sizing on this is Telnet is still alive and well. You've got a big slice of Telnet right here that's still out there, about 13 million machines. Or sorry, 11.3 million machines. Anyways, lots of fun stuff. So we'll start going through some of it. So first thing, basic stats. There's about 156 million IPs that were found so far in the scan. Every UDP service I scanned, MDNS, UPnP, SNMP, and NetBIOS, I scan the entire internet for it every 7 hours. So I know that one's solid. Like, if you have got a Windows machine that gets online in a cafe on an external range, I'll find it. And if you go to a different cafe the next day, I'll find it again and correlate the MAC addresses. Like, yep, you got these 2 IPs for this machine. So that's all fairly well done and organized. TCP was more random mode because it takes so long to scan it. So I scanned something like, I think I've got TCP services about 140 million of 156 million hosts. So, but it's a different ratio of those. Sometimes they have some ports, sometimes they don't have other ports, depending which ones I scan when and where. It's a little bit more piecemeal. When you look at all the services, you still have web being the majority, still combined, 80, 443. And SHODAN has really good data on web. So if you ever want to look into surveys about what's the most common web server, what is the most common header, what an SSL, what's the most common SL key size, the SHODAN surveys are awesome. Go look at those. I'm not going to dig into web at all. I think it's awesome, but it's been very well covered by other folks. The scary thing was, 35 million machines with SNMP, the 30 million UPnP, and the 148,000 devices with VxWorks debugger are still enabled, which is basically read-write memory of a device with a debugger already in Metasploit for 2 years. So talking about VxWorks, I love this thing. Basically, there's every little device on the planet as of 5 years ago ran VxWorks. These days, that ratio has been going down a little bit. But the Mars rovers run VxWorks. We found out that it would take about 30 days to brute force the telnet password on them using the password encryption weakness, just due to the round trip time of TCP connections. But we'd have to hold up in NASA for 30 days with guns and then brute force it, and it didn't seem worth it. But we found out, these things you can read and write memory, so you can basically dump the entire running image of the device, find out, hey, this is how the logic of this particular control works, like authentication, and then knock out that check and then write the memory back into the device. Most of these devices don't have memory protection at all, so you can overwrite the running code in memory to replace the login routines, to replace any kind of functionality you want on these devices, and just go right through it. So it's basically like carte blanche access to all 148,000 machines out there, and you can scan for all of them in 7 hours. And they're still there. Now, granted, that's down from 250,000 in July. So I already killed my little dramatic pause, but yep, 149,000 still. So it's gone down by a little bit in 2 years, but not enough to really make much of a difference. That difference is really by the vendors who care. These are the vendors who still don't care, who still can't replace the gear that's already out there. I'm flying through this. This is great. So MDNS is great because you can find all kinds of cool stuff. This is known by MDNS Responder, Bonjour, Avahi. By default, a lot of Linux distributions install Avahi daemon on the machine just with the default configuration of Ubuntu, for example. And it's really stupid because now this thing exposes all kinds of fun information about your system to anyone on the network. And you can register all kinds of cool services out of here. But there's lots of really neat stuff that pops up in these lists. So if you look for some really strange stuff that comes up in the MDNS advertised lists, and there's only a few million of these devices out there, a few million devices that respond to MDNS, like 6, 7 million, I think. You'll see a whole bunch of TiVo boxes advertise the TiVo service as being an internal service on it. They also advertise Myth TV, Snap TV, Direct TV. Every set-top box basically has MDNS running on it and advertises video streaming services. So a neat way to go say, let's own all the TiVos, yay, done. Same thing with a lot of NAS devices, actually, like Ready NAS, Maxtor, Black Armor, some of the Seagate boxes, the GoFlex stuff. They actually all had MDNS exposed to the world as well, which didn't make any sense, but that's what I configured. What was kind of fun is these iPhone surveillance service that shows up all over the place. There's actually a whole lot of these things. This is actually a NAS side service for integrating with a surveillance system tied into your iPhone. So if you have a home surveillance system set up, this is the service on your NAS device that lets your iPhone look at it with their client application. But again, now you know, okay, here's all the people that have home surveillance setups at their home. Let's just go to the web service and look at everyone's house. So it's scary data to have. One of the things that I really found interesting was some of the really weird specific stuff from vendors. Like CellBio was one that showed up as a service, like CellBio Instrument. It's like, this can't be anything but awesome. Like, it's called CellBio Instrument. I really want to see what this thing is. We'll actually look at it in a second. Find Pump Monitor as a service name. Like, I probably don't want to scan Pump Monitor. I don't want to stop monitoring that pump, whatever it's doing. I don't know where that pump is or what it does, but it's probably not good if I touch it. A company I used to work for, I found a couple of their devices on the internet using the MDNS exposure as well. So it leaks some really weird things you can't find any other way. There's also some vulnerability indicators. You can see machines advertising the fact they've got distcc exposed, which is basically just a remote shell waiting for you to run commands on it, and it's used for parallel compiling basically. And its default configuration isn't too bad these days, but it limits it based on RFC19 addresses. Doesn't limit it based on passwords. So if you have network access to it from a machine, you can still do anything you want to these machines by default, and Samba, TOTP, etc. So with that, here's some cool stuff. Here's the Floor Chem Laboratory. This is what CellBio maps to. The CellBio instrument is a whole system for doing like video capture with different light frequencies of like cellular crap on slides. So, and there's a whole review and gallery and all kinds of really cool stuff. Check out the temperature though. The temperature of this thing is negative 22°C on this camera. So, and it's got all kinds of cool functions like reload firmware, upload flash of firmware. Like, I don't know what you can do with this thing, but it looks scary if you can actually start reconfiguring it. So here's examples of some biologic surveys done with this thing. It has nice little galleries, and it's almost like a Facebook for like cells to hang out and show off their stuff. So anyways, really cool stuff here. I'll do a little close up here in a second too. Here's one of the little slides of some stuff growing on a plate under weird light. So anyways, the weird crap you find on the internet when you start looking for the things that don't look like the others. So lots of kind of unexpected findings from this stuff. So moving on to a couple other things, VNC, everyone loves VNC. There's actually lots of implementations. A lot of lights out boxes like IPMI cards now support VNC as well to control them. So lots of things implement VNC as a protocol. And it's got some pretty weak password configuration, usually just like a static string. The encryption's DES by default, just standard DES encryption, so you can break that pretty quick. And some versions of 4.1 of real VNC and below had authentication bypass flaw. It only affected certain protocol versions and only some systems. So I was like, well, let's look at every VNC server on the internet I can find and then actually start seeing how many of those are probably vulnerable to authentication bypass. Most of them. So of this set, I think it's something like 132,000 devices have RFB 0308, which is the one version that is affected by this. They could be the patch version, but most of these really are pretty old installations of real VNC. You can see some other slices around here, but basically the majority, and I cut out all the ones that are below a certain mark or ones that had some cruft at the end of it, but just from a basic protocol version breakdown, you can see the most widely exposed version of VNC is the most widely exposed version of VNC. MySQL's fun too. When the whole MySQL authentication bypass flaw came out recently, I went through the data and tried to figure out how many of these are actually exploitable. The crazy thing about the MySQL one was you actually had to find a 64-bit box of certain versions of certain builds were vulnerable. So if you look for like one Ubuntu 0 as the version name in MySQL's banner, you knew that was an Ubuntu box the right version, but you couldn't tell whether it's 64-bit or not. So you had to go through and do a whole follow-up of scanning all those machines with mmap, trying to figure out 32 versus 64-bit based on the OS fingerprints. So about 1.8 million machines of MySQL are open to the internet, just in general. Half of those had no host ACL, so when you connect to them, they actually you just start brute forcing them like mad. And half of those probably still didn't have passwords. I just didn't bother testing that. And all of those altogether, about 50,000 at the time were vulnerable to this straight bypass. So there's your data loss. There's 50,000 database servers with who knows what in them sitting out the internet that you can basically just keep trying to log in into get an authentication attempt. Like for folks who aren't familiar with the bug, you can give it any password you want, and 1 out of 256 attempts would accept your bad password. So you basically just run the login command in a loop till you get in. And it's awesome. And 50,000 machines sitting out there full of all kinds of fun data just exposed. So that's why we're all screwed. NetBIOS is a lot of fun, and I'll go into this a little bit. Of course, you get the system name for NetBIOS, you get the domain name, which is cool if you're trying to find out where a particular machine is, what company it works for, the user works for. One unknown trick about NetBIOS, you can use it to enumerate multi-homed hosts. Basically, when you ask NetBIOS for a status request, it comes back saying my name is this, my MAC address is this. If you come back and then say, okay, now what IPs have this name, it'll enumerate every IP address on that system remotely without authentication. So you can use it for multi-home detection. The Metasploit NetBIOS Probe module already does that. So just do user auxiliary scanner NetBIOS Probe and scan your heart's content, and you'll find out all your multi-home machines on your local system right away. So really neat way to find multi-home boxes. I haven't gotten that far with this data set yet, just as 13 million boxes, it takes a while. But all the MAC addresses were fun to look through, because you look at MAC addresses being globally unique. So every vendor gets a little 3-byte prefix, and they've got 3 bytes they can allocate to their hardware. Bluetooth, Ethernet, and Zigbee, I think, all use the same OUI allocation for addresses. And so vendors are supposed to allocate an address and then pick things out of this address range to use with their systems. So they should be unique. So how many people screwed up unique addresses? Most of them. Qualcomm has 80,000 devices out there that have the same MAC address. Just for one MAC address. So hopefully you don't get 2 of these things in the same network, or that one of them won't work anymore. ASUS has a couple lines here under different names, but basically they've got about, actually more than that, 40,000. Yeah, something like this is a logarithmic scale, because it's hard to show otherwise. But I think there's like around 50,000 machines that ASUS has shipped have the same MAC address too. And this isn't just small vendors. VMware, of course, because VMware allocates MAC addresses randomly based on the magic seed, so those are going to eventually conflict. So that makes sense that there's lots of VMware and lots of Zen down here. It doesn't make sense that Hewlett-Packard has a bunch of duplicate MAC addresses, or Dell, or Intel, or Xerox, or 3Com. So when you think about your MAC address being unique or using it as a forensic indication, it's not really unique. And here's proof that there's no such thing as a unique MAC address. The most common MAC address I found was 005655, then all zeros, and there's 1.3 million machines on the internet who use this MAC address. The reason for that is it's a tethering adapter. So it's a software adapter on the machine by a vendor that comes up with the same MAC address no matter what for the interface. So every machine using this tethering adapter has the same MAC address. So great, now I've got a list of every person on the internet using this tethering software. So there's some of the neat findings. I didn't get a chance to dig up one of them, but there's a version of Windows XP called Windows XP Black. That's this like hacked up rogue version that doesn't get security patches anymore. And they all have hard-coded MAC addresses too to bypass licensing checks. So if you find any machine out there with that MAC address, you know it's a pirated version of Windows XP Black. So there's all kinds of cool kind of inference you can do between MAC addresses and vulnerabilities and things like that. So I'll release the data later on, but this is kind of just a quick look at it. So SNMP is awesome. I'm going to dive a little bit into it. I know I've got a little bit of time left, and I want to have some demos and questions. 33 million devices, SNMP public, which is awful. But SNMP does all kinds of cool stuff. SNMP will tell you, what ports are listing on the machine, what IP address it has, what routes it knows about. The MAC addresses of all of its neighbors on the same network. If it's a Windows or Linux machine, it'll tell you a list of all processes running, all software packages installed, all local user accounts. And we actually dove into some of the data and have some of the fun information from those deep scans on those Windows machines too. So I'll dive into that in the 5 o'clock talk as well. So lots of cool data. But if we wanted to take a very particular take on this and say, well, let's exploit some Cisco routers. How would we do that? Well, the tricky thing is Cisco routers are very kind of fickle about how you exploit them. You have to get the hardware version right, you have to get the firmware version right, you have to know what image is running, you have to get all this very precise data to reliably exploit them. But Cisco releases about 40 vulnerabilities a year, 40 devices a year overall. How often do most people flash a router? So I'm guessing never. They sit out there until they go away and you replace them with something else. So if you look at a scan of every router on the internet that had SNMP open, then he mapped that to the vulnerability database and what advisories affect what particular version. So I basically just blatantly stole the NetBIOS code and used that to scan our SNMP database and used that to basically match against it. And found that on average, most routers have at least 60 unpatched flaws across the internet in general, which is not really surprising. But the most exploitable version of iOS in production right now is iOS 12.2. So 12.2 is the first version that had enough features, that had enough vulnerabilities, and never got patched enough that it's still the most widely exposed version of Cisco iOS out there. It's different from the most common version of iOS, but it's the one with an average of about 95 vulnerabilities per machine with Cisco iOS 12.2. So if you have a Cisco iOS 12.2 box, you should probably think about patching it. So if we're trying to tune an exploit to work on Cisco iOS, we really have to know lots of magic numbers. We have to know the hardware information, the RAM specifications, runtime configuration, iOS version, the build names. You find some really crazy stuff with the build names because Cisco likes to do a lot of one-off compiles for different ISPs. So you see, this was built for a custom Celia intercept project by this engineer at Dell or this engineer at Cisco in the actual Cisco SNMP version info coming back. So grepping this database for like CALIA or law enforcement was really fun to see what came back as custom build information. So we're trying to find what was the best target to exploit. If I wanted to hack as many Cisco routers as I possibly could in the shortest amount of time, what's the version of Cisco iOS I should care about that's the most widely exposed, that I can easily find, easily fingerprint? So looking through all the stuff, trying to find out what the best configuration was, ended up being version 12.4.15T7. There's over 12,000 routers with that particular version, and the next version down is just around 6,000. And they kind of taper off pretty quick. So there's a very few number of Cisco iOS versions out there that are really popular. And these are scattered across the entire world. If you search for the string in the UI, you'll see the global distribution is pretty wide for this thing. As it kind of tapers off, you see there's a bunch of 12.2. So we talked about 12.2 being one of the worst versions out there. This particular version of 12.2 52SE has about 6,000 boxes sitting out with that version. And these are only Cisco devices with SNMP exposed with public. I'm actually running a scan right now that we'll talk about at 5 o'clock, which is which one of these have private. And if you're familiar with Cisco iOS and SNMP and private strings, private lets you retrieve and overwrite the configuration file of the device remotely, including all the passwords. So we'll get some good stats on that in a little bit. Just waiting for the scan to finish. So if you want to play around with it while we go through this, that's the URL for it. And then we'll do some questions, some demos, things like that. Looks like I got plenty of time to go through it. Awesome. All right, so while I switch gears, any questions offhand? Great. So here's a version of the portal. Let me, let's see. This one's got IPs on it, but if your IP shows up here, sorry. It's got everything in it, so you're not special. So here's 135 million machines in this particular dump of the database. Here's global distribution count across the globe for which IPs were where. US was the most heavy in terms of concentration. So if you mouse over stuff, we'll say, hey, look, we've got around 30 million machines in the US that were found by the scan. So lots of cool stuff you can find. And I'll lose one of my, let's see, here's one I like. Hacked by. So here's the distribution of machines that have the string hacked by in one of their banners sitting out there. You can see there's 3,600 of them, mostly US, but pretty wide distribution across the world. And there's lots of cool things in here. Like you can go through and find that, let's see, hack PC, hacked by, let's see. So this guy named TigerMate apparently hacked everything on the planet. And no one really noticed. Then you got you're hacked just for fun, things like that. So all kinds of fun data you can just grab out of this thing. Some other fun keywords to look for are things that are very industry specific. So looking for SCADA, for example. Like who actually cares about SCADA and who's got machines named something SCADA related. And hopefully someone won't kill the server while it runs. There we go. So 1,200-ish machines that have SCADA someplace, but concentrated in the US. Very much so. But definitely everywhere too. If we look through, let's see. A couple other terms I want to look at, like CALIA is a good one. Is anyone familiar with CALIA? All right, so CALIA is the law that lets law enforcement tap ISPs. And so if you look for a distribution of services, this is where things get really funny. Hey, how come there's this little black dot in Europe? What really cares about CALIA in Europe? That's not the US. Like US, Canada show up, of course, but what's this little dot? It's Romania. So Romania is hardcore with their CLIA gear and all the stuff they have around CLIA. They either have CLIA in their banner of a website or they have a system named CLIA something. As we dig through it, you'll see, I don't want to go too deep in this one because there's some really awful crap in this list, but we'll go into that one later on. Let's see, any other requests for things that you want to look for? So look for a thing called Bsides. Probably not much of anything. 7 hosts. In the US. Looks like we've got a little bit in South America too. Argentina, there we go. Oh, Ukraine too, looks like it. Cool. Anyways, so fun stuff. You know, I'm really short on time and I'm surprised because I took way too long otherwise. But I've got lots of fun data to go through too. That's the password you want to see. There you go. That password doesn't work, by the way. I actually tried, it didn't work. I had to go get the real password later on, so it's a fake one. Sorry? Sorry? Root and a hash. What's talk about that a little bit. I'll do one better. I'll just do shell and then pound. Let's see. Hopefully this will show up. We'll dig into that one more at 5 o'clock. I've got a bunch of examples for that one later. Any other questions for this particular scan or anything else? Awesome. Well, I finished early, which I'm sorry about, and it means you can drink more in between. So I'll leave you there. Thank you very much. Oh, great, thanks. Hang on, we got some giveaways. I got a couple questions. San
Francisco, and then these are cases Samsung Galaxy S3 and iPhone 4S.
Awesome, great, yeah. All right, so got there's trivia questions. So can anyone tell me what the 3-byte prefixes are for VMware's MAC addresses? Both of them, both ESX and for Workstation. What's the second one? No. What's the second one? What's Workstation and ESX? They have 2 different prefixes. Anyone else? All right, you got closest then. Here you go. I'll start with that. All right. Anyone else? If you found port 17185 on the internet, what is it? There we go. Quick one. Sorry. All right. You don't want iPhone? Okay. You get a T-shirt. There you go. All right, if you were trying to guess between how many machines are on the internet that ran Vista and an SNMP Expose, or that ran Windows NT 351 and an SNMP Expose, or Windows NT 4.0, do you think there'd be more NT, more 351, or more Vista machines on the internet? 4.0. 4.0. Who is first with 4.0? Here you go. You want a phone or iPhone cover or a shirt? Shirt? Okay, here you go. All right, I got 2 more to go. Let's see. Your mother.
That was just common knowledge.
If you can give me your mother's name and it returns more than 10 hits in the search portal, you get a T-shirt.
Robin.
Robin, all right. Well, full name. And maiden, actually. Let's see. Trying to give me their questions offhand to this thing. Can anyone define what an inner packet gap is? Oh, inner packet gap as it relates to sending packets on Ethernet networks that are IP. Like, if you're trying to send 1,000 packets per second, what does inner packet gap tell you about your traffic, and what does it mean you have to change with your rate limiting? All right, never mind. That's a weird one. Sorry? No, it's the hardware level delay that you have to account for that actually takes up phantom bandwidth on the network. If you're looking for the most common, let's say, what's the most common SNMP service in Brazil by vendor? FiOS? No, okay. That one's easy. It's actually UCD SNMP version 4.12. Let's see. If you're trying to find, let's see, let's guess this thing. How many F5 networks machines are on the internet right now? And just over under. How many? 35,000. Anyone else want to bet over under on that? Over 35,000? Yeah. Anyone for under? Under. Let's see.
You realize this people like spinning up machines. 60,000. There's somebody with an EC2 account and bet 5.
Hopefully the server doesn't die on us here. It's not hard to. This box is tiny. It's got like 8 gigs of RAM. There we go. So yeah, 2.1 million. So who is over? Crap. We have 1 shirt left and 1 iPad cover. What do you prefer? You're closer. There we go. All right. Sorry. Thanks. Thanks again, guys. Appreciate it.